In this lesson, we're going to take a deep dive into Dialog. We'll dig into Dialog basics and explore terms including nodes, conditions, context, and responses. We'll also look at exactly how the Watson Conversation Service evaluates Dialog. And finally, we'll take a look at the Dialog tooling. In Watson Conversation, dialogue is a logical flow that determines the responses provided when considering context and any entities or intents that are identified. Let's start with intents and entities. Given the utterance, "Tell me about Yosemite National Park," we already know this expresses the "tell me about" intent. We also talked about creating a national park's entity, whose values might include Yosemite, Yellowstone, Arches, and more. We can use Watson Conversation to tailor a specific response when certain conditions are met. For example, we can create a condition that is matched when the "tell me about" intent is identified and the national park's entity is identified. This condition would match both "tell me about Yosemite National Park" and "do you have information about Arches?" To match only "tell me about Yosemite National Park," we need to update our condition and add the value clarifier to our entity. Once we have a condition, we can provide our response. You can use the entity syntax in your response. Since the entity value was Yosemite, we get "I love Yosemite." In a coming lab, we'll see how to craft this example using the Watson Conversation Service. For now, we'll go ahead and learn about the terminology. There's quite a bit of terminology that we'll need to learn. We've already touched on some of it with conditions and responses. We'll revisit those, but we'll also look at nodes, branches, turns, base nodes, child nodes, and peer nodes. A node represents a single interaction in the conversation. A node is triggered when its condition is met, and when it's triggered, it provides any associated responses. There are a few special conditions that I'd like to point out. There's conversation start. This condition is set to true at the beginning of the dialogue and false for every subsequent dialogue turn. There is the true condition, which always returns true, the false condition, which always returns false, and finally, there is the anything else condition. This condition can be used at the end of the dialogue. It will be processed when the user input does not match the condition of any other dialogue node. The anything else condition always evaluates to true. Thus, its response is returned whenever its node is reached in the dialogue tree. Placing the anything else condition at the end of your dialogue guarantees that your dialogue will always return a response. A branch is a sequence of dialogue nodes that represent a conversation with the user. A branch is used when the conditions of its base node match the user's input. A child node is used when a prior node requires more processing or input. For example, a user might say, "Tell me about a park." The base node here would respond with, "Which park would you like to know about?" This puts us into the base node's branch. On the next dialogue turn or user input response cycle, the child nodes will be evaluated. Dialog evaluation is the way in which Watson Conversation processes the user's input against the dialogue flow that we've defined. A dialogue always requires a node to start from. This is known as the contextual node. At the start of a conversation, the contextual node is the virtual conversation start node. At the start of each evaluation round, the children of the contextual node are evaluated. In the first round, that means we evaluate the top level nodes. The condition of each node is evaluated in series. This means that the order of the nodes matters. The first node whose condition evaluates to true will have its response process. If no node evaluates to true, then you won't get a response. However, it's recommended to always set up an anything else node. This node acts as a failover. Thus, if no conditions match, we'll always get a response. Let's assume node T2 evaluates to true. Node T2 will now be set as the contextual node. This means in the next evaluation round, node T2's children will be evaluated in series. If a child node matches, its response is processed. If no child matches, then the dialog will attempt to evaluate using the top-level nodes. If none of those match, it will fail over to anything else. As you might expect, the Watson Conversation Service provides excellent tooling when it comes to helping to construct and build a dialog. Nodes, conditions, and responses are all very easily managed using the dialog tooling. We'll see this in a coming lab. In this section, we learned quite a bit about dialog. We explored some of the dialog basics, and we used intents and entities together to create conditions to match user utterances. We also explored some of the dialog terminology, terms like nodes, conditions, responses, and more. We took a deep dive into the dialog evaluation mechanism to understand exactly how that works. And finally, we had a brief glimpse at some of the dialog tooling for Watson Conversation Service.